Tell John to unmute.
Aloha, everybody, and good afternoon. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We have everything set up here, just letting a few last participants join the room. So wonderful to see such a great turnout on this Sunday afternoon for our closing spotlight on the East West Center exhibition that we're holding at this current time. And the closing spotlight is called Spotlight on East West Center Artists in Residence, Charlot, Affandi, and Yi. And so this program is in conjunction with closing our current exhibition entitled Beyond the Surface that we're beginning to deinstall today and closing today, that features works from our permanent collection. And the subset of the collection that is featured are gifts that were directly gifted from artists. So I'm joining you. My name's Annie Reynolds, and I'm the curator at the East West Center Gallery. And I'm here with the entire East West Center Arts Program team. Eric Chiang, Arts Program Coordinator. Navahine Lanzalati, Arts Program Assistant. Marina George, Student Assistant. And Lynn Najita, who is responsible for our installation design as well. So we have everybody here. I did want to give a very special acknowledgement and thank you to Marina George for all of her work in coordinating today's program, because without her, this program wouldn't have been possible. So mahalo, Marina, for all the extra hours that you put in helping us to bring together today's program. So really special. So this current exhibition, unfortunately, we haven't been able to reopen to the general public for our gallery space. We've now been closed to the public for 18 months, but we've been continuing the work, and we've been able to share out programming through these virtual spotlight programs, and we've really been able to turn our work towards our permanent collection. And that's what part of this Beyond the Surface project has been. It's been a great opportunity to return and focus our energy on our incredible permanent collection. And it's really been enlightening for us to look back and look at the artworks, reconnected with the artists who have gifted some of these beautiful pieces to the center over the years, to hear about their recollections about their time at the East West Center, and to hear more about the work that they're doing today. So it's really been an incredible project. The exhibition was installed in February, and we've been reconnecting with artists since that time. So with today's program, we're really coming full circle. We have works that we're talking about that aren't installed in the exhibition. They're all larger collections permanently installed in Imam Center and our conference center, large works. And it brings us back to the original, to the first artist in residence at the East West Center from 1967. So we'll be talking about 3 artists and 3 pieces. So Wisdoms of the West, which that's one title, that's the current title, but there are other titles as well. Wisdom of the West by Jean Charlot. Wisdoms of the East by Javanese artist Affandi, and a lesser known work called, it's literally translated to Place Where East and West Cultures Meet and Learn by Chiang, the Silent Traveler. So we're going to begin today's program with our first presenter, who's going to talk about Wisdoms of the East and West by Bronwyn Solium. So welcome, Bron. Bronwyn Solium is the former curator of the Jean Charlot collection at Hamilton Library at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And Bron has incredible and extensive knowledge and experience about Indonesian arts and culture. So she's the perfect person to speak on behalf of these 2 beautiful murals. So can we please run Bron's presentation?
Who remembers Jefferson Hall in 1967? In those days, it was a humming place. It was the center of the East West Center, and it was full of people. They came as students, they came as administrators, they came as faculty from the university to read magazines supplied by the East West Center Friends, to pick up their mail, to meet each other, to go upstairs to a meeting, downstairs to the cafeteria, where they could dine on Saga Food Services' wonderful food. What is wrong? with that picture, or beside the saga food, there's no reference to works of art that are suitable in scale or gravitas to match the art in this building. And in 1967, Affandi and Jean Charlot changed that. Who were these people? Well, both of them were in their 60s. They were internationally known artists, and they have been recruited by, if that's a good word, Professor Minoru Shinoda, director of the Iswa Center's Institute of Advanced Projects. He wanted their voices for the arts and humanities to contribute to the Senior Fellows program. So here is Jean Charlot. His friend Edward Weston once wrote that, "Write me please, so few of us live for art," and Charlot indeed lived for art. He was a very skilled artist in a number of media. He was a capable teacher. He was an art historian. And he's very, very well documented. I recommend the Jean Charlot collection, the Jean Charlot Foundation, and the Archive of Hawaii Artists. And he's best known in some areas just because he's terrific at a certain thing. If you're a printmaker, you love his prints. But he also created many, many murals in his life. And since we're talking about Walt, I might mention that he was a very successful archaeological artist at Chichen Itza, recording the colors from the beautiful painted walls as they were excavated and unearthed. But his own career started in Mexico City in the 20s as a member of the Mexican Mural Renaissance, about which he wrote. And he was credited by some for creating the first fresco mural there. Who was Affandi? Well, he was, at that time, a preeminent Indonesian painter, a modern painter recognized for his spontaneous and rapid methods and style. And he was very prolific, and he painted maybe about 4,000 paintings. He's also well documented. He has a lot of material about him in Indonesian and in English, and I recommend the scholarly writings of Dr. Astri Wright in particular. Charlot came with his family. Big frescoes require a lot of helpers, and he brought with him his daughter, Katika, and the young man beside him there is his son-in-law, Sabta Hudoyo. He also brought his wife, his second wife, and his 2 children. So on the left, in this photo, he is up on the scaffold with his 2 helpers. Katika has signed underneath the photo, underneath the newsprint, and the Javanese characters beneath the newsprint transcribe as Sabta Hudoyo and their address. In the page on the right, we recognize Affandi's distinctive signature with initials and a pictogram. And in the clipping beneath, the woman dressed up in Indonesian formal dress on the left is his second wife. Their children also came, Rukmini and Agung. And in the photograph from the news clipping from Charlot's regular column, weekly art column, he couldn't resist writing about how art begets art. There was quite a few good quotes that I've managed to find doing this. And the first one comes from Charlot's newspaper article, where he writes, "Art begets art," and he describes Rukmini above and Agung above and Rukmini below, quote, busy penciling small murals of their own, faces to the scaffold where Affandi, helped by his daughter Kartika and his son-in-law Saptahodoyo, executes large works of art. So what of Charlot's painting? This is his painting. It's known as Inspiration, Study, Creation. The figure of inspiration on the left and creation on the right. And again, he writes very articulately about it. It was intended to represent art of the West, the Occident, and he continued, the scene is enclosed in a cube that prolongs the elusive perspective of the surrounding architecture. I used linear perspective, also called Italian perspective, as one of the unique features of Occidental art. You should see this in the picture when you come up the stairs and stop at the mezzanine landing in the center. Large hands enclose fire. The hands stand for human effort, the fire for creativity. The two figures flank the central motifs. Their form and attitude suggest the classical arts of Greece and Rome that are the basic foundations of our Occidental art. They are mirror images of the statues of Greece and Rome. To emphasize this, I decided to paint these statues in cool colors. On the left is inspiration, looking upwards, representing the elements of poetry or genius inclusive in all discoveries, be they in art or science. On the right is study, self-centered, reading a book, suggesting factual research and a sense of history. Here is the view from the stairs. I would guess as soon as Jefferson Hall was completed, years before 1967, Charlot was out casing the joint, looking for walls that would be suitable for murals. That space appealed, and you can see that when you walk up the stairs, the mural incorporates the beams of the actual ceiling. For him, location really mattered. Here is Affandi's painting. Its title is Wisdom of the East. Charlot Affandi drew his own left hand, which is very funny because it contains the three of the great figures from Eastern philosophy and religion and art. We recognize Gandhi. In the center, he says, the center is a Buddhist monk. He could be Chinese, he could be Japanese. And on the right is the figure of Semar, who is very famous as a wise man in Indonesia. All three of these figures together, who, as he says, are seated in the hand of God, represent the wisdom of the East. The waves around them represent the ocean, which they had to cross to come to the center. It didn't take very long for Charlot's mural to be known as Wisdom of the West. And these are close-ups of their signatures because they rather define their distinctive characteristic styles. Affandi signed in the lower left corner of his mural with his signature pictogram, an image of the sun and 2 feet, and a brief inscription, A and 1967. Charlot also signed in the lower left, but typically he recorded the range of days that he worked to complete his fresco. He was a systematic record keeper. Affandi was very spontaneous. Now it's time to introduce Evelyn Giddings. She was an artist herself, but she was hired as Charlot's assistant and indispensable helper. She worked with Charlot on many of his murals and big fresco projects, and she was also a great teller of stories. She told the story of the figure on the left, part of a 1934 mural that he painted as part of an early WPA project in New York, a woman in classical style. And in 1935, the headmaster of the school where it was painted ordered it painted out because it was considered obscene. Sadly, when the mural was restored a few years ago, it wasn't uncovered. I have no idea what Charlot thought or said, but Evelyn loved to say that he waited over 30 years to redress this situation. And you'll see that inspiration, also wearing crown of leaves, is sitting there in the same pose, and not one of us has paid attention to her obscenely parted knees. It's time to introduce another resource, pocket diaries, which Charlot kept from 1922 to 1979, documenting his daily activities. They're a huge source of information and help if you can read his writing, and more to the point, if you can interpret the French shorthand, 19th century, Imade Budi, which he learned when he was a schoolboy for efficiency. Going through the 1967 diary, you can see he records July 17, a mention, East-West Center, fresco wall with Affandi. He took Affandi to see the wall that he had picked out for making a fresco. He must have proposed that project then. The next record we find is a very interesting one. Evelyn get portable fresco from Tiny House. Well, Tiny was Tanimoto, Tsukasa Tanimoto, the plasterer on the right. Charlot had worked with him on every single wet fresco mural that he completed in Hawaii until he died. So Tsukasa Tanimoto was a very, very loyal supporter of the artist. Evelyn had to pick up the portable fresco, and here's what we're talking about. Charlot had a system where he used a sheet of kanak, had Tanimoto plaster it exactly as if it were a wall, 2 layers, a thin layer on top, and while it was still wet, the second layer wet, it would be used for the student to practice applying the paint, not paint, but pigment powder mixed with water in the brush to create a wet fresco, or in proper language, buon fresco, true fresco. This was Affandi's effort, mangoes. If he created a preliminary sketch, as Charlot himself would have done, it hasn't been preserved, but it does reflect Affandi's distinctive, rather spontaneous style, and I'm sure it's based on a memory of a mango tree in Java with the fruit covered in the wicker baskets that protected it from other hungry creatures. You'll notice that the signature is simpler. In the bottom, it just says the initial A, 1967. There's no pictogram. There was also quite a bit of talk about their themes and what they should do. And I think they agreed between them that all they could do was feature large hands. And beyond that, each artist had to go with his own style and his own character. And Affandi's was always to paint without much premeditation, certainly not a series of plans. So here he is with what appears to be a very first sketch of hands. It was preserved in the Charlot collection, as were Charlot's sketchbook. And here is a considered sketch of hands that Charlot had obviously worked on and was ready to scale up to the full-size cartoons. So when he did that, it was before it would be traced, ready to actually transfer it to the wall. And I think Affandi felt that he needed to do that. So his preliminary drawing was very simple, and he must have tried quite a few. Then Charlot set a different process in motion with the giornata. He Giornata meaning daily task. He simply used the phrase task 1 or task 2. And here is task 1. In his diary, he simply records the number 1 in a circle and says, first day frescoes, Jefferson Hall. That phrase and that simple entry covers an astounding complexity of work and coordination. His process was very demanding. So you had to get the plasterer to make his 2 layers of plaster, and then you had to wait till the top layer was almost dry. You had to have your tracing taken from the full-scale cartoon, ready to lay it across the wet plaster with the butt of a blunt nail. Charlot would incise the design, just the lines, through the paper onto the wall so that it was just grooves. And then you would mix and apply the pigments, and the grooves would make very nice divisions between the layers of color. So it was quite a bit of work to do, and at the end of the day, Tanimoto would come back. He would clean up around the giornata, the day's work, and make sure there was a clean edge so that the next day you could apply the plaster, or that day you could apply the plaster for the second task. So how does it look? Here is task 1 almost finished and task 2 just beginning. Charlot is painting that he's probably putting a finishing touch on dry plaster, creating what's called fresco secco, dry fresco, touching up the part of the hand that he's already painted because that was task 1. And on the right you can see Tani's very tidy edge where the hand has been trimmed and the plaster on the right the wall on the right is ready for the plaster. On the left he's already plastered it, and Evelyn is hanging the tracing paper. So when you have to work that hard, it's a terrific coordination effort. With Affandi it wasn't the same, and I think Affandi's process was totally different. He didn't find the buon fresco process suited him. He adapted a technique to suit him better, which was mainly fresco secco. He could work on a larger scale, and he actually worked faster to complete his mural with his 2 helpers than Charlot did. He was still on task 5 when Affandi's last touches were completed and the scaffold came down. But there was another factor that was unexpected. He was, according to Kartika and Evelyn both, very, very uncomfortable about heights. And when he made his mangoes, he was on the floor, he was fine, he loved it, he was really happy doing it. But when he had to go up a scaffold, he wasn't comfortable. He wanted to hurry up the process, I think. And so when the scaffold came down and there was some touching up, Evelyn was the one who had to go up the ladder under his direction. So they finished, and they had a formal gift ceremony on almost the end of September. Howard, the Chancellor of the East-West Center, accepted their gifts. They were gifts, not commissions. And Affandi's wearing a suit. Charlot's in his favorite comfortable cardigan. And you can see that the next day their East-West Center term ended. Affandi's Indonesian friends had a big party, and 2 days later Charlot was driving them to the airport. So that was the end of the project. But Shinoda, Professor Shinoda, who has to be thanked for that we have any art at all, hoped that the projects would continue in some way. The Charlots visited Affandi in Java in 1968. They went, but Affandi never completed another mural, but the mural has continued to attract attention in other ways, and that's a story that's waiting to be told. Thank you.
Incredible, Bron. Thank you so much for preparing that talk for us and sharing such an incredible background on these two treasures that we have at the East West Center. So mahalo to you, Bron, for bringing that wonderful talk together for us today. Mahalo. Our next presenter is Kate Lingley, and she is going to be speaking about the other artist in residence, Chiang. Kate Lingley is an associate professor of art at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, with a focus on Chinese visual arts and culture. So welcome, Kate. Aloha.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Bron, for that wonderful presentation. And in fact, it's a privilege to continue on, and I think that the two talks will kind of intersect pretty interestingly. At least I hope you find so. So let me show you the images that I brought. So can everybody see that okay? All right. So this is the painting that I am going to be discussing today. And this is a painting that was brought to my attention when my student Marina contacted me because it had been found hanging in an office in the East West Center without any attribution. And she asked me if I could translate the inscription that you see in two vertical columns on the left-hand side, which, you know, was a fair thing to ask. And so I said, of course, let me see. And I saw that it says, the gathering place for East-West humanities, 东西人文荟萃之区, and I'll more about exactly how that's worded later. And then so that's the larger characters on the right, and the left column says, summer 1968, the silent traveler, Jiang. And this got me very excited because Jiang is a really fascinating character for all sorts of reasons, and a Chinese exile who spent 40 years, sort of involuntary exile who spent 40 years as an expatriate apart from his family, a sort of accidental artist and art historian, a translator and scholar of literature, really a remarkable character, a remarkable chronicler of the 20th century in the UK and the US through his travel writings, for which he's probably best known, and his brush sketches. But I had no idea that he had any connection whatsoever to Hawaii or the East-West Center. So how did he come to produce a painting so clearly made for and dedicated to the East-West Center, both through its title, and I think you can observe without too much trouble that we're looking at the mountain skyline of Manoa Valley, and which is populated with these wonderful figures in the foreground, about whom a little more later. But first, the question is, who was Jiang? Right, and I will say, by the way, that Bron has done such a good job in illustrating the way in which Jean Charlot and Affandi put together their mural project as a kind of with Charlot kind of representing the West and Affandi representing the East, and to the extent that there's then a summing up of their relationship through the East-West Center, I think this painting is it. This is a much smaller painting, about 3 feet across, so not intended for not a kind of painting in situ like the murals, and it was completed in 1968, which is the year following the senior fellowship, and so it seems that Jiang went home to New York and did it, and then sent it to the East-West Center. But I think it's worth looking at who Jiang was, because like many 20th century Chinese people, his life spanned periods of radical change in the history of China, but also in the history of the world. And to some extent, you know, this is a man who had very little formal training as an artist. And in fact, the various things he did for his living throughout his life are things that it wasn't entirely clear that he was trained for, but things that he came to incidentally by the kind of circumstances that he was thrown into. And so in that respect, I think it's worth starting out by asking who was Jiang? So here's a picture of him looking very friendly. This is probably shortly after his arrival in England in the early 1930s. So Jiang was born in 1903, and he was born into a well-to-do family in Jiang, which is in the Jiangnan region, the sort of lower reaches of the Yangtze River drainage basin, which is historically, and really since at least the Song Dynasty, a center of painting culture. Jiang Yi was born into a large extended family that all lived together in a big compound, which was very traditional. His father was actually a portrait painter of some note and is often described as a literati artist, but traditional social categories like literati artist were already breaking down in the last years of the Qing dynasty. And just to remind everybody, the Qing dynasty ends in 1911. So he's born into this family. In his childhood, he really is situated in this family that takes the traditions of an earlier age very seriously. So he's, well, for one thing, he's betrothed to his first cousin when they're both still in utero, which is, there's a vow made that if one is a boy and one is a girl, they shall be married to each other. And in fact, that's what happens. He was trained in the Jiang clan school. There was a clan school. The family basically hired a tutor for all the children and given a classical Chinese education, which meant the Confucian classics, poetry, calligraphy, literature. But even before 1911, the shape of education in China was changing pretty radically. In 1911, the family is, Jiang is kind of not too far away from the spot where the 1911 revolution first broke out. So the family kind of flees to its country land holdings to avoid the chaos. Also a very traditional thing to do, but then returns to Jiang. And after the revolution, instead of being trained in his family school, he's going to a public high school, which is part of the educational reforms instituted by the early Chinese Republic. If you probably know that the first president of the Republic was our homeboy Sun Yat-sen, who was went to, I think, both Punahou and Iolani at a certain time, but was raised in Hawaii anyway. So he goes to a public high school in Jiang, a kind of modernizing high school, and then starts college in 1919 at Dongnan University in Nanjing, where he majors in chemistry, right? So already you can see that this is not necessarily a path which is leading directly to a future as an artist. He's interested, in fact, in the industrial applications of chemistry. Like so many young people of his time, he was full of idealism for reform and for supporting China's modernization and industrialization. In fact, after he graduates in 1926, there's a period in which the university suspends operations because of warlord fighting in the area. But eventually he manages to finish. And when the university is suspended in this period, he goes home and he's immediately railroaded into actually marrying the cousin to whom he had been betrothed his entire life. This was not really a completely loveless marriage, which nonetheless produced 4 children, which tells you something about the power of a sense of duty. But anyway, after graduation, he runs through a kind of amazing array of short-term jobs, starting with high school chemistry teacher, ranging through university admin to local magistrate. And it's kind of interesting that he lands in local government because, in fact, there's this long historical tradition by which it is the duty of the educated man to serve the state by serving as a government official. It's a very traditional thing to do. And Jiang Yi is clearly a person of ability, but the times were changing so fast that it was no longer clear what a person of ability should be doing for the new republic. He actually, this is a period when between World War I and World War II, when many Chinese students studied abroad in all kinds of different fields, everything from industrial fields to military science to art to all sorts of things. So Jiang Yi applied for a scholarship to Germany to study dye chemistry, but he didn't have enough German for it. So he was not able to do this. And eventually he embarked, and he was developing a sense of disillusionment with his government job, in which he had to fight a lot of really petty corruption and very small time obstacles to really just getting anything done. So eventually he embarks for England in 1933 in the hope of studying political economy and local government, again in the service of China, and he is admitted to the London School of Economics to study these subjects. At the same time, about the time that he leaves for England, he publishes a book of poetry, or I guess shortly after he leaves for England, he publishes a book of Chinese poetry, which again, doesn't, I think in our modern sense of a chemist who's now switching to political economy, it doesn't seem obvious that he should also be a poet, but he's been raised in this tradition by which poetry is one of the normal activities of the literate man. And we'll come back to that poetry because several lines of his poem are actually hiding on the painting in the form of a large seal impression. So Jiang becomes part of a community of Chinese, he's received by and then becomes part of a community of Chinese intellectuals in London, who had been there for a while, but were not really much recognized by people in the UK. So he writes in his letters at this time about being subject to the kind of everyday sort of what we might call microaggressions or sort of petty discrimination of a UK which didn't recognize any particularly useful contribution from a Chinese gentleman in London. At the same time, this community of Chinese intellectuals were well known to each other. And Jiang eventually shared a flat with the playwright Xiong Shiyi. And they had a spare room. And so as a result, they ended up hosting various visiting artists and intellectuals in the period they lived together between about 1934 and 1936. So this included the very, very famous painter Shubei Hong, the probably world's most famous Peking opera star Mei Lanfang, Liu Haisu, an early Chinese modernist painter. Liu Haisu in particular was interested in mounting exhibitions of Chinese art in London, and not just, previously exhibitions of Chinese art in the UK had limited themselves to porcelain and silk and, this kind of traditional art forms. Liu Haisu mounted an exhibition at the New Burlington Galleries called Modern Chinese Painting Exhibition. And this raised British interest in Chinese painting such that Jiang, again, remember, he's a student of economics and local government, but he's commissioned to write a book called The Chinese Eye, which was an interpretation of Chinese classical painting and calligraphy aesthetics for Western viewers. And really one of the earliest such books in English aimed at a kind of popular audience. It's very successful. He also has some paintings in this exhibition and sells them. So it's sort of moving into a state in which he's actually making some of his living from painting. I had to show you this photograph because I suspect this photograph was taken by Jiang. He's not in the picture, but it's such a wonderful picture of all of these great people standing out in front of Claridge's in London, the great department store. So from left to right, you've got Paul Robeson, Anna May Wong, Essie Robeson, Shi Xiong. This is Jiang flatmate. Mei Lanfang, the Peking opera star, and then Wang Xiaolo, who was a Peking opera producer. So I think he's maybe traveling with Mei Lanfang. It's just such a great illustration of the kinds of connections that were being made between intellectuals in the UK, kind of outside of much consideration of actual UK intellectuals. So the way in which the Chinese community in London supported a lot of these people. About this time, Jiang was also sort of famously responsible for coining the Chinese brand name for Coca-Cola, which is Coca-Cola, and kind of widely known as one of the best translations of a brand name in any language. It means tasty and makes you happy. So the Coca-Cola company held a contest in, I want to say 1935, for a better translation than the one they had been working with, which was sort of nonsensical. And Jiang won £5 for coming up with the best possible answer. And Coca-Cola is still known as Coca-Cola to this day. So perhaps lesser known part of his legacy. He started to teach Chinese in 1935 as well, at what was then called the School of Oriental Studies in London. It's now SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. under actually Reginald Johnston, who had previously been the tutor of the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, Puyi. So if you ever saw the sort of well-known movie, The Last Emperor, Johnston is a character in it. And in fact, Jiang attempted to start a PhD in Buddhist studies with Reginald Johnston, because that's what you do after you get a master's degree in political economy, right? I don't mean I'm not making fun of Jiang, but I want to make the point that these kind of twists and turns that his life took were not necessarily things that you could have seen from the very beginning, foreseen from the very beginning. And he started also to travel a little bit in the UK and produce very often very charming paintings of what he observed and saw. This is a painting that he did of the panda enclosure at the London Zoo. So the London Zoo was one of the first European zoos to have pandas. And so this is his kind of slightly fantastical sketch in a traditional Chinese style, depicting the pandas and this English gentleman watching them. I want to say that this was one of his illustrations for another book that he published called The Chinese Childhood, which was about his growing up in China. But it was also about this time, 1937, that he realized that he couldn't go back. That war had begun to descend on China. Japan had invaded from Manchuria that year, and he looked into going back home, and he realized that things were too chaotic, and so he should stay in the UK and send money back home. He also sold paintings to raise money for war relief in China, as many patriotic painters did. But that was a bit of a fateful decision, because in fact, he didn't go home again until the very end of his life in the 1970s, after the Cultural Revolution. And bear in mind, he had a wife and 4 children back in China, so he really was quite separated. And so when you look at the charming quality of his paintings, it's really a contrast with the writings that you see in his letters, which are really rather melancholy about the separation that he endured. But the books for which, this is about the time he starts publishing the books for which he becomes best known, which are the Silent Traveler series. These are mostly all still available. There's about, I didn't count exactly how many there are, there's 12 or 15 or something. So the Silent Traveler in New York, the Silent Traveler in Boston, the Silent Traveler in London. The first one was actually the Silent Traveler in the Lake District. And they're books of travel writing, in which he responds to places he visits as an outsider, right? As a Chinese man encountering such places for the first time. And so they're illustrated with his brush drawings and paintings. These color paintings are used for the covers, but there are also quite a lot of line illustrations done with a Chinese brush in the text. And again, charming is really the word that you need for these. This is the swan boats in the public garden in Boston, which was a part of my childhood, so which is why I picked this one. And again, you can see the technique is traditionally Chinese, but the views are modern. So in 1939, his house was destroyed in the Blitz. He moved to Oxford. He worked as a painter, and lived through the war in Oxford. But in 1946, these Silent Traveler books were incredibly successful. So his publisher sends him to New York in 1946 in order to research and write The Silent Traveler in New York. And again, these kind of expatriate intellectual communities of Chinese were also present in New York. So while he's in New York, he meets Lao She and Hu Shi, these two great kind of literary greats, as well as Pearl Buck, who's sort of famous for writing The Good Earth and other kinds of novels that were set in China. And he basically becomes a great success in publishing these Silent Traveler books, both in the US and the UK, and travels back and forth. as the 1950s opened, there's a great kind of growth of Asian studies in the US. And he's actually offered a position at Columbia teaching Chinese. This is an adjunct position. And in fact, he teaches for them for a long time, but they never offer him a professorship, which again, I think was one of the areas in which, at least partly, I suppose, because he didn't have a PhD, but also, because they just wanted him to keep teaching Chinese. And so he's really moving into a time when he's a literary scholar. He's teaching Chinese, he's teaching literature. He has a fellowship at Harvard in the late 50s for his project of translations of Chan, or we should say Zen poetry. And he first comes to Honolulu in 1960. The dean, we'll go back to our painting here. UH Dean Shunzo Sakamaki, for whom Sakamaki Hall is named, used to organize guest teachers for summer courses and brought in quite a number of really well-known people over the years. And so Jiang first was invited to teach in summer of 1960. I haven't been able to find out what he taught, but I am assuming it was language and literature. And he maintained a connection to the place. Dean Sakamaki, I think, invited him again in 1963, but that didn't work out. And then in 1967, he was one of these three senior fellows at the East-West Center who were artists. And I think before this started, Bron was telling us a little bit about this event that Dr. Shinoda really wanted to bring in, even though the focus of the East-West Center was maybe originally pretty political and politics and economics and international relations and so on. Dr. Shinoda really wanted to add art and humanities to the mix of senior fellows. And so this is why Jiang found himself in Honolulu in 1967. He came back to Hawaii once again in 1971 for another summer teaching gig. But that was also not an East-West Center fellowship. That was teaching at UH. And he died in 1977. So that was sort of the end of his Hawaii connections. So he was here in 1967, but unlike Charlot and Affandi, his artwork was not completed until 1968. So I can only assume that he painted it in New York and then sent it back as a gift to the center once it was complete. Looking at it as a work of Chinese painting, right? It's got the title, which is done in very ancient bronze characters. 东西人文荟萃之区. The place where the gathering place for East-West humanities, but the word that's being used for gathering here really implies a gathering of eminent or noteworthy people. So it's a sort of an homage. And there's two small seals here, which are the artist's own personal seals. One has his name, Jiang, and the other his kind of sobriquet, the silent traveler. There's also this big seal over here, which I have blown up, which actually took a little digging, but this is a line from one of his poems that was written in 1933, just at the time that he was leaving, and probably I think written on shipboard as he was leaving China to go to England. 大洋洲里看初日，汝独平生未见书. It means looking at the rising sun from the deck of a boat in the great ocean. It's like reading a book that one has never read before in one's life. So it's sort of a wonderfully kind of optimistic, and I think in keeping with the whole artwork, a wonderfully optimistic view of his life of traveling, which we know from his other writings was maybe not always as easy as the charm of his writing and his painting really suggests. But I love the idea that A New Horizon is like a book that you've never read before. It's a lovely thought. And so looking at this painting as a whole, you see this collection of figures in the foreground, and I'm just going to show one detail of them, the group in the center. If you just look at them broadly, I think you can see even from this distance that they're all dressed in different sort of mostly Asian forms of dress. Here's the small group in the front and center, which is really in light of the way in which Charlot and Affandi did their frescoes, this is really fascinating because we've got our kind of Greek philosopher in the middle, right? And we've got our three East Asians in conversation with him. We've got a Chinese gentleman, a Korean gentleman, and a Japanese gentleman. And then surrounding them, all these other figures in various forms of regional dress, which we could pick apart if we wanted to. Interestingly, very few of them look like they're intended for specific individual people, except for Gandhi over here. Who I mean, it's hard to imagine, it's hard to read this little figure as being anyone other than Mahatma Gandhi. But the rest of the figures don't seem to be intended to be anyone in particular. You know, at first I thought, oh, maybe this is Confucius, but if this were meant for Confucius, you would need a Taoist and a Buddhist, and we don't necessarily have that. Well, actually, this is a Taoist back here. I'm sure there's a Buddhist in here somewhere. But all these wonderful little figures, I think, are really intended to illustrate the bringing together of East and West, which was, of course, the goal of the East-West Center. Living in exile in the middle of the Cold War, cut off from China, cut off from his family, I think life in some ways must have been difficult for Jiang. But clearly the idealism behind the founding of the East-West Center really spoke to him, and that, I think, more than anything else, really explains the whole, this painting taken as a whole, in which this green and lovely Manoa Valley that we all, I think, love so much is populated by people from all over the world who come together to meet each other. And that is the end of my presentation, but I have one more picture that I want to show you because, Bron, when you showed Affandi's fresco, and you mentioned the Buddhist monk who might be Chinese or Japanese, I realized that you might not know that he actually comes from a very famous painting. So here is the monk of Affandi's painting. This is a Southern Song painting, so probably a Chan painting. It's a Zen painting from the Shiko's dates are a little unclear, but let's call it 11th or 12th century. A hanging scroll, ink on paper, in the collection of the National Museum in Tokyo. In fact, most of Shiko's work is held in Japan. And so to say he could be Chinese or he could be Japanese is really quite on the nose because it's a Chinese painting in a Japanese collection. But I had forgotten, I hadn't seen that fresco in so many years that I had completely forgotten that the Buddhist monk was quite familiar. So with that, I will stop the screen sharing, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Kate. That just gives me, it almost brings tears to my eyes to see that final image. So thank you. Speaking of coming full circle, we're also familiar with that image in Affandi's work, and to see it there. And it's just been this project of this incredible uncovering of all these incredible treasures and stories. So Bron and Kate, mahalo. Thank you so much for sharing all of these treasures, all these stories behind these incredible artists and these works. It's just incredible to hear. So so in kind of bringing it back to the current exhibition and the permanent collection, it's great because these virtual spaces make it possible for us, in conjunction with this exhibition, to feature these stories that are related to our collection that we're not able to show in person in the exhibition space. And as Bron mentioned, those early works, they weren't commissions, they were gifts, and it really speaks to the connection between the center and the artists, and this kind of gathering space that we're seeing, kind of these threads pulling together. So continuing on beyond that and kind of establishing that our collection initially as gifts, it continued, and we have gifts of over 400 works in our collection, and many of them gifts directly from artists who've been in residence over the years. And again, they've all been gifted and we have never commissioned work. So it's really incredible to just hear a little more about that history. I'm going to share in the chat the virtual photo photos of the current gallery exhibition that's up, and so you can peruse that afterwards. And just in closing, I wanted to bring attention to one project in particular that's in that current exhibition. Let me pull up my screen share for a moment. And you'll see these two works, and this is in the exhibition, and this is the East-West Center Gallery. And so what we have here on display is a pairing of two sets of works. So on the left hand, we have Impressions of Hawaii, and on the right, we have Impressions of Pakistan. So Impressions of Hawaii is a set of 3 works on watercolor paper from 1985 by Pakistani artist Musarat Imam. So she was an artist who was an East-West Center student at the art department at UH Manoa, and she went on to work for the Pakistan National Arts Alliance, and I believe she was the director of the art gallery, the National Art Gallery in Pakistan as well. But she worked as a student at the East-West Center arts program when she was here. And these works, they're on watercolor and watercolor paper, crumpled, inspired by traditional Hawaiian kapa. And so we shared these images with Kumu Auliʻi Mitchell, who during the pandemic has been doing some incredible work with innovative and new kapa. So we just shared these images with him and just said, what did these images inspire you? And they just kind of piqued his inspiration. And so on the right, you see Impressions of Pakistan. And he shared, he came and visited just last week in the gallery and shared just a little bit about his process. So we'd like to share his process and his thoughts and inspiration on creating these works with you.
Aloha kakahiaka ia kākou. Aloha e nā manu kanilea o ke ia aina. Mai ka la hiki a ka la akau a puni nā moku a mina kai e walu. Aloha no, aloha no, aloha no. Greetings to everybody. Greetings to the cheery voiced birds of these lands. From sunrise to sunset, the 8 great seas and the 8 great islands. Greetings indeed. My name is Auliʻi Mitchell. I want to thank the staff here, Annie Reynolds and her staff here at the East-West Center Gallery, for allowing me to have my impressions on kapa that I'm going to talk about the process today. So my process began with the inspiration of these 3 pieces to my right. These are the Impressions of Pakistan by Musarat Imam. And I was invited to come and view her pieces, which are actually her impressions on watercolor paper, and it was manipulated in a way to resemble kapa. And so when I was invited to see these pieces, I became just so inspired by her choice of color. It reminded me of much like the Middle Eastern colors. And so that then led me to the first part of my process, to go and research more about Pakistan. What could I find about Pakistan that I could put on traditional Hawaiian bark cloth we call kapa? So I came upon their architecture from thousands of years ago, and the mosaic patterns on these architecture buildings that they had really resonated in me. And so I was able to focus on that, the mosaics of Pakistan. And so how could I do that on kapa? Well, first of all, the kapa in these pieces were grown right outside my front door in Kailua, here on the island of Oahu. That process is about 1.5 to 2 years to grow. I was able to speak to them, chant to them, honor the goddess Hina, who made kapa sacred, Hina ke kapu, and then also the aumakua of kapa making, Maikoha, his daughters, the twins, Lahuiki and Laahana, and the great master of color of aumakua known as Ehu. So my process would begin, of course, with the plant itself, and then gathering the plant. The plant is called wauke, or a paper mulberry, and we cut that, and I use a method of removing the outer bark. After that, it's soaked in water, and I do the first stage of beading we call mo'o. And once you get a few pieces of the first stage mo'o, then they're pieced together, and then they're pounded out to what we call kapa. So the impressions of Pakistan led me to this beautiful pieces here. How could I replicate the designs on their early architecture in Pakistan? Since we got our patterns from nature, normally on kapa we use what's called ohika pala, or bamboo stamps. But again, the designs that we get are from nature, and geometric designs we put on the bamboo stamp. So I went to the plant we call la'i, or lauki, the tea leaf. I took the stalk of the tea leaf, I cut it so it had a moon shape, and then I was able to manipulate that stalk of different sizes to come up with these patterns that look like mosaics that are very similar to those on the architecture in Pakistan. I also wanted to find similarities between our cultures, so we could celebrate that. And one of them here is the what we call the kanapi, or the centipede, which we're quite fearful of here in Hawaii because of its bite. But as I read more and researched more on the Middle East and places like Egypt, they're not feared because oftentimes these are the very creatures that take care of the dead. So I was able to come up with a pattern called a kanapi for this one. And these are just other patterns I found very similar to those that you would see on different old architecture in the Middle East and Pakistan itself. So I've left impressions of Pakistan on kapa, and this whole process of kapa making includes a process of dye making. All of these here, these four right here, are made with earth dyes, including that of Awliya from Hawaii. I have two colors of Awliya in here. We have the red, and we have a yellowish color. Yeah, I was able to mix the two dyes to get other colors as well. If we move over to this pattern here, this is my work with watercolors. I wanted to see how watercolor would take to our bark cloth, or our kapa. And as you can see, it took very, very well. And on this piece, I wanted to match very symbols to her work as well from her country. So I took one of the most royal symbols of our people called the kahili, feathered standards, and again, all made with the tiny tea leaf stalks, and then a little depth in this piece, as you can see here. But again, this is the kahilis of our people, and watercolor. Not traditional, but again, if we don't evolve in our work that we do, we stay stagnant. And so next to Musarat's work, I'm just so honored to be part of this exhibition. Mahalo, mahalo nui. Gratitude indeed. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you especially to Bron, to Kate, and to Auli'i for sharing his mana'au. We will be reopening a new exhibition in the coming weeks or months, whenever we're able to reopen our space. Our next exhibition is called Living Legacies, Paintings and Performances of Bali, and will be featuring paintings by Balinese artist Imade Budi and his son Imade Moja. Imade Budi was in Honolulu in 1978 and had a solo exhibition. And so we're honoring that exhibition with a new exhibition. Both father and son are painters, but are also performers. And many of the subjects in the paintings that we'll be showing are subjects related to performing arts in Bali. So many of the paintings will be paired with performance elements as well. So really bringing the paintings alive in the exhibition space. So we're looking forward to sharing that with you soon, hoping that we'll be able to reopen the gallery at least through small groups reservations. And so the date's still to be determined on that, but we're looking very much forward to that. and getting people back into the gallery. And we will, for those of you who aren't in Honolulu, we'll also be sharing programs and images from the gallery so that we can also continue connect with our audiences outside of Honolulu as well. So thank you again to everybody for sharing these incredible stories. I'm still, my mind is just blown with all these wonderful stories, and look forward to gathering with you all again soon. So thank you for joining us today. Mahalo.
Thank you.